Imagine being born into a millionaire's mansion with everything, money, toys, luxury, but never being able to take a single step. That was Daniel's life, trapped in a wheelchair, hopeless and forgotten, until one day, a new maid walked in, a woman no one expected, who carried a scar, a secret, and a strength that would change his life forever. What she did next left the entire mansion in shock, and it will leave you speechless. Welcome to BrainFuel, the channel where we bring you powerful, true-to-life stories that will touch your heart and ignite your mind. Every story here is crafted to inspire, to motivate, and to remind you that miracles can happen when we least expect them. If you believe in hope, courage, and second chances, then hit that subscribe button and join our family. Because we promise, every story will stay with you long after the video ends. Everyone whispered that the boy had everything, except the ability to walk. In the heart of the city stood the grand Harrison Mansion, a palace-like estate with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls that shimmered with wealth. From the outside, it looked like a place where happiness must surely live. But behind those golden gates was a truth that money could not hide. Daniel Harrison, the only child of the millionaire, was born into luxury that others could only dream of. From the moment he opened his eyes, life gave him everything. Everything, except the power to move freely like other children. His legs, fragile and unresponsive, refused to obey him. Doctors described it in complicated medical terms, but to Daniel, it meant only one thing. He could not walk. As a baby, his parents hoped time would heal him. Maybe he's just a late bloomer, his mother whispered with trembling hope. But as months turned into years, the reality settled in. Specialists were flown in from different countries. Famous surgeons examined him. Therapists stretched his limbs. Medicines were tried one after another. Each time, his father wrote checks big enough to buy houses, desperate for a cure. Yet the result was always the same. Daniel's legs remained motionless, like stubborn branches refusing to sway with the wind. By the age of 10, Daniel had lived through more hospital visits than birthday parties. His life was measured not in games played, but in therapies endured. He had the latest wheelchair, the best tutors, the softest bed money could buy. But what is comfort when your spirit feels trapped? Outside the mansion gates, he could hear children laughing, running, kicking footballs in the streets. Sometimes he would watch them from his window, pressing his small face against the glass, his heart aching with silent envy. The sound of their joy was like music he could never dance to. He wanted so badly to join them, to scrape his knees, to fall and rise like they did. But instead he sat still, a prisoner of his own body. Inside, Daniel grew quieter as the years passed. He didn't smile often, and laughter seemed like something he had forgotten. Servants tried to cheer him with toys, sweets, or even silly tricks, but Daniel would only nod politely, his eyes distant. What good was a toy car when you couldn't run after it? What joy was there in balloons when you couldn't chase them into the sky? His father, Mr. Harrison, was a man hardened by business. He loved his son deeply, but his way of showing it was by trying to buy a solution. "Don't worry, Daniel," he would say, patting his son's shoulder. "One day, I'll find the best doctor in the world. One day we'll fix this." Yet, deep down, Daniel no longer believed in those promises. Each one day felt like a cruel reminder of what would never come. His mother, gentle and emotional, would sit by his side for hours, reading him stories of heroes and adventures. Sometimes Daniel asked her, "Why do heroes always run into battle? Why can't they be like me?" She would smile sadly and say, "Because maybe, my love, your battle is different." Still, no words, no comfort, no luxury could erase the emptiness he felt. Daniel's world was one of watching but never joining, of dreaming but never doing. And with each year, his hope grew dimmer, like a candle flickering in the wind. The mansion itself reflected his isolation. Its vast halls echoed with silence, broken only by the clicking heels of servants and the ticking of grandfather clocks. Rooms filled with expensive art and rare antiques brought no joy to the boy who longed for something simple, a chance to run barefoot in grass, to chase butterflies, to stumble and rise again. And so, Daniel built a wall inside his heart. He stopped talking much to others. When visitors came, he avoided their pitying stares. He hated when people bent down to his level, speaking slowly as if he were fragile glass. To him, every word of pity was a reminder of what he couldn't do. His days blurred into one another. Wake up, dress, sit in his chair, watch others live the life he was denied. He often wheeled himself to the window, staring at the garden below, imagining what it would feel like to run across the green field, arms wide open, the wind brushing against his face. But imagination was all he had. Sometimes, at night, when the world was quiet, Daniel whispered to himself, "Why me?" He had everything children could dream of, except the only thing he truly wanted. Yet destiny has its own strange way of working. Just when the world seems unchanging, just when despair feels permanent, life sends someone unexpected to shift the story. Daniel didn't know it yet, but beyond the mansion gates, a young woman was preparing to enter his world. She didn't come with medical degrees, nor with the wealth of kings. She carried no promise of miracle cures. But what she carried was something far greater, belief. And that belief would soon light a fire in Daniel's soul that no amount of money, medicine, or pity had ever been able to spark. The Harrison mansion was no stranger to new faces. Servants came and went, cooks were replaced, nurses rotated every few months, and tutors lasted only as long as Daniel tolerated them. Most staff members entered the grand estate with excitement, dazzled by the luxury, but they left quietly, often defeated by the heavy atmosphere that seemed to linger around Daniel's silent presence. But one morning, a new maid arrived. Her name was Grace. Grace was unlike anyone who had worked in the Harrison household before. She came from a small, struggling village far from the city, a place where survival meant working harder than the sun itself. She wasn't polished in the ways the other servants were. She didn't wear expensive perfumes, and her shoes were worn from miles of walking. Yet when she stepped through the mansion's golden gates, she carried herself with a dignity that no silk dress or diamond necklace could imitate. She was tall, with strong arms from years of labor, and her skin glowed with the resilience of someone who had weathered storms but never bowed to them. Her eyes, dark and steady, carried stories of pain and survival, of losing much yet never losing hope. Unlike the timid servants who bowed their heads quickly, Grace looked around the mansion with quiet confidence, absorbing the grandeur without letting it intimidate her. Mr. Harrison had hired her out of necessity. The last maid had quit suddenly, overwhelmed by the constant demands of caring for a wealthy household and the silent, unresponsive boy who rarely acknowledged anyone. Grace had been recommended by a friend of the staff manager, and her references spoke not of elite training, but of grit, honesty, and strength. "She's hard-working," they said, "and she doesn't break easily." That was enough for Mr. Harrison, who barely had time to meet her himself. On her very first day, Grace began her duties. She cleaned rooms with precision, scrubbed floors until they shone, and moved with a rhythm that came from years of knowing that every task mattered. But it wasn't the sweeping or the dusting that caught Daniel's attention. It was something else entirely. Daniel had been sitting in his usual spot by the wide bay window, his wheelchair angled so he could stare outside at the children playing football in the garden. He had learned to tune out the movements of servants. After all, they came and went, always whispering pity behind his back. But this new maid was different. Grace walked into the room, carrying a basket of fresh linens. She stopped for a moment, observing him without the slightest trace of pity. Then, with a firm but gentle voice, she greeted him. "Good morning, young sir." Daniel's eyes flickered toward her, then back to the window. He didn't reply. By now, he had grown used to people addressing him out of politeness, out of duty. They didn't really see him. They saw his wheelchair. And so, he had built a habit of ignoring them before they ignored him. But Grace didn't walk away. She set down the basket, pulled a chair, and sat beside him, something no maid had ever dared to do without permission. Daniel frowned slightly, and used to anyone interrupting his silence. "Do you know why those kids run so fast?" she asked, nodding toward the garden where the neighborhood boys chased the ball with joyous shouts. Daniel turned his head, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. "Why?" he asked softly, almost against his will. Grace leaned closer, her voice steady and low. "Because they believe they can." The words hung in the air like a spark in the dark. Daniel stared at her, uncertain whether to be annoyed or intrigued. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that. People usually told him what he couldn't do, what he shouldn't try. Yet this maid, on her very first day, had spoken a belief, as if it were more powerful than doctors, more powerful than money. Daniel turned away, refusing to let her see how her words unsettled him. Still, something in his chest shifted, like a door unlocking just a fraction. From that day on, Grace refused to treat Daniel the way others did. She didn't fuss over him like a nurse. She didn't talk down to him as though he were fragile. Instead, she spoke to him as if he were capable, strong, and deserving of respect. When she cleaned his room, she asked him questions. Which book should I put here? Do you like the window open or closed? At first, he ignored her, but Grace had patience forged from years of hardship. She didn't give up when silence greeted her. She kept talking, kept smiling, kept reminding him that he was not invisible. Days passed, and slowly Daniel found himself responding in small ways. A shrug, a nod, one-word answers that grew into short sentences. For the first time in years, someone had cracked through his wall of silence. And it wasn't a doctor, a tutor, or even his parents. It was a maid who spoke to him not as a burden, but as a boy. And Grace noticed things others didn't. She saw the way Daniel's hands tightened on his wheelchair whenever he watched the children outside. She saw the quiet frustration in his eyes when servants whispered pity behind his back. She saw the longing he tried so hard to hide. One evening, she caught him staring at his legs, his face filled with quiet despair. Instead of offering sympathy, she said, "Your legs may be asleep, but I can see the fire in your eyes. And fire can wake anything." Daniel didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to dismiss her words as nonsense. Yet another part of him, small, fragile, but alive, wanted to believe her. Grace's arrival didn't just bring a new worker into the mansion. It brought something Daniel hadn't felt in years, a spark of possibility. And though he didn't know it yet, this woman with scars hidden beneath her strength would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about his own limits. Night in the Harrison mansion was usually silent, a silence so heavy it felt like it pressed against the walls. The servants retired to their quarters. The millionaire locked himself away in his office with endless paperwork, and Daniel remained in his room, surrounded by toys he never touched and books he rarely opened. That night was no different, at least not at first. Grace, finishing her chores, carried a bucket of water down the hall when she heard something unusual. A soft thud, then another, then a faint, muffled sob. She paused, tilting her head toward the sound. It was coming from Daniel's room. She placed the bucket aside and pushed the door open gently. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. Daniel was on the floor. His wheelchair sat slightly behind him, tilted at an awkward angle. His small hands were pressed against the carpet as he struggled to push himself up. Tears streaked his cheeks, and his lips trembled with frustration. "I'm useless," he whispered through clenched teeth. "I'll never walk, never." Grace's heart clenched. She had seen many forms of pain in her life, but there was something different, something piercing, about the silent suffering of a child who had given up on himself. She stepped inside, her footsteps soft against the carpet. Daniel didn't notice at first, too consumed by his own despair. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "You're not useless." Daniel froze. He looked up sharply, embarrassed that someone had seen him this way. His first instinct was anger. "Go away. You don't understand." His voice cracked, but his eyes burned with shame. Grace didn't move. Instead, she walked forward and, without hesitation, lifted the hem of her skirt just enough to reveal a long, jagged scar running down the side of her leg. The sight startled Daniel. His tears paused for a moment, curiosity overtaking despair. "Do you see this?" she asked, pointing to the scar. Daniel nodded slowly. "This is from when I was a little girl," Grace continued. Her voice didn't waver. It carried the weight of truth. "There was an accident. A heavy cart rolled over me. The doctors told my parents I would never walk again. They said my leg was too damaged, too broken. My family didn't have money for special treatment or expensive chairs. They gave up on me." Daniel's eyes widened. He couldn't imagine someone else hearing the same words he had lived with his whole life. But I didn't give up on myself, Grace said, her tone fierce now. Every day I tried. I fell hundreds of times. I cried, too. There were days I thought the doctors were right. But I told myself, one more step, just one more. And do you know what happened? What? Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. My legs obeyed me again. Not overnight, not quickly, but step by painful step. And now, she lowered her skirt and stood tall. Now I walk. For a long moment, the room was silent. Daniel's eyes were locked on Grace, his breathing uneven. Something inside him shifted, like a flame being lit in a dark cave. But I'm not you, he muttered, the old despair tugging at his words. Grace knelt down until her face was level with his. Her eyes didn't soften with pity. They blazed with conviction. No, you're not me. You're stronger. You've had doctors, machines, people around you. I had none of that. If I could fight, then so can you. But only if you believe. Daniel's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to him this way. People either drowned him in sympathy or avoided the subject of his legs altogether. But here was this Maid, a stranger only days ago, looking at him as if he were capable of miracles. And then, in a move that took Daniel completely by surprise, Grace extended her hands. Come on, she said gently. Let's try together. Daniel's heart raced. Now. Yes, now. Every part of him screamed that it was impossible. His legs had never held his weight. He would fall. He would fail. But Grace's hands didn't shake. Her belief was so steady, so unshakable, that it wrapped around him like armor. With trembling fingers, Daniel reached out and grasped her hands. Grace pulled him carefully to his feet. His legs trembled violently, his knees threatening to buckle. His body leaned heavily against her as fear surged through him. I can't, he gasped. Yes, you can, Grace whispered firmly. Don't look at the floor. Look at me. Trust me. Daniel lifted his gaze. His legs screamed with weakness. His body wobbled, but he was standing. Not for a second, not for a fleeting moment. He was truly standing on his own 2 feet, with Grace steadying him. Tears welled in his eyes. I'm standing. Grace smiled, her grip firm. Yes, Daniel, you are. It wasn't walking. His legs couldn't yet carry him forward. But for the first time in his life, he felt the impossible begin to bend. When he finally collapsed back into his chair, his chest heaved, his face was soaked with tears. But there was something new in his expression, a flicker of pride, of hope. Grace knelt beside him once more. This is only the beginning, she said softly. If you're willing to fight, I'll be right here to fight with you. Daniel didn't respond immediately. His hands gripped the armrest of his chair, his mind replaying the moment over and over. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just imagining what it would feel like to stand. He had felt it that night. As Grace left the room, Daniel whispered something he hadn't said in years. It was so soft, she almost didn't hear it. Thank you. Grace smiled to herself in the hallway. She knew what Daniel didn't yet understand. This was no small step. This was the beginning of a miracle. The morning after Daniel first stood on his trembling legs, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a grand change, not the kind that servants whisper about in the corridors, but for Daniel, something inside him was no longer the same. The boy who had once believed his body was nothing but a prison had now felt a spark of possibility. Grace, sharp-eyed and relentless, noticed the change immediately. She didn't give him time to second-guess himself or let fear drag him back into despair. As soon as the sun rose, she was at his door. Up, she said briskly, throwing the curtains open to let the morning light spill into the room. Daniel groaned, rubbing his eyes. Up for what? To fight, Grace replied simply. Every day from now on, you and I will fight, step by step, inch by inch. Daniel hesitated, doubt clouding his face. But it hurts. Last night, I thought my legs would snap. Grace crossed her arms. Pain is proof you're alive. And being alive means you can fight. Do you want to live as a prisoner? Or do you want to learn what freedom feels like? Her words were sharp, but not cruel. They carried the same fiery conviction that had lifted him to his feet the night before. And slowly, reluctantly, Daniel nodded. That morning marked the beginning of a new chapter, one written in sweat, tears, and persistence. At first, progress was agonizing. Grace helped Daniel out of his wheelchair, steadying him as he struggled to remain upright. His legs quivered violently, his face twisted with effort, and within seconds he would collapse back into the chair, his body drenched in sweat. Again, Grace said every time, "I can't." Daniel would cry, his voice breaking with frustration. "You can," Grace insisted, her tone unyielding. "Stand, even if it's for 1 second longer than yesterday." The first week was brutal. Daniel fell countless times, his knees scraping against the carpet, his arms aching from catching himself. More than once, he broke down in tears, sobbing that it was pointless, that he would never be like other kids. But Grace never allowed him to quit. When he cried, she knelt beside him, her hand steady on his shoulder. "Do you think I didn't cry when I was in your place?" she told him one evening after another painful attempt. "Tears don't mean you're weak. They mean you're fighting harder than ever before." And so Daniel fought. Days turned into weeks, and each morning, the boy who once dreaded life found himself waiting, though he wouldn't admit it, for Grace's knock on the door. Every day, she pushed him, and every day, he managed just a little more. By the second week, Daniel could stand for almost a full minute with Grace's support. By the third, he managed to take a shaky half-step before collapsing. Each tiny victory lit his eyes with a spark that hadn't been there before. The mansion staff began to notice. They whispered among themselves as they passed in the corridors. "Have you seen the boy lately?" one maid asked. "He looks different." Another nodded, lowering her voice. "I heard he's standing," with that new maid's help. Even the servants who had once viewed Daniel with pity began to watch with a mixture of awe and curiosity. It was as if a long-dead flame had been rekindled in the heart of the household. Mr. Harrison, however, remained skeptical. One evening, he found Grace helping Daniel practice in the drawing room. Daniel's small body shook violently as he tried to take a step, his face pale with effort. Mr. Harrison's heart clenched at the sight, but his fear overshadowed his hope. "Stop this at once," he ordered. "You'll hurt him." Grace turned to face him, her voice calm but firm. "He's not breaking, sir. He's building." Mr. Harrison's brow furrowed. "The doctors said it was impossible. What makes you think you can succeed where they failed?" Grace met his gaze without flinching. "Because the doctors see his weakness. I see his strength." Daniel, panting heavily, looked between them. For the first time in his life, he spoke against his father's doubt. "I want to try, Father. Please let me try." Those words silenced the room. Mr. Harrison had never heard such determination in his son's voice. Slowly, the millionaire nodded, though worry still shadowed his face. From that day on, he didn't interfere, but he watched closely, silently hoping Grace was right. The struggle continued. Each attempt drained Daniel's energy, but also built his resolve. Grace taught him exercises to strengthen his legs, lifting, stretching, balancing. Sometimes, she made him practice standing by holding on to a chair, refusing to let him sit until he gave it everything he had. There were failures, many of them. One afternoon, after collapsing for the 10th time, Daniel pounded his fist on the floor, shouting, "I hate this. I'll never be normal." Grace knelt beside him, lifting his chin so his tear-streaked face met her steady eyes. "Normal is overrated," she said firmly. "You don't need to be normal. You need to be strong. And you already are." Her words became his fuel. Slowly, painfully, progress began to show. Daniel's arms grew stronger from supporting his body. His legs, once thin and lifeless, began to respond, trembling less with each attempt. He learned to balance for longer stretches, to take small, wobbly steps with Grace by his side. The first time he managed 3 full steps without falling, Grace clapped her hands together, her eyes shining. "You see? You're proving yourself right." Daniel's chest swelled with pride. For the first time, he felt a sense of control over his own body. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every fall became less a defeat and more of a lesson. Every tear became fuel for the next attempt. The boy who once sat silently at his window was now a fighter, his spirit burning brighter with each passing day. And though he still had far to go, Daniel knew something with absolute certainty. He was no longer the prisoner of his chair. He was on the path to becoming something greater. The day of Daniel's birthday arrived with a brilliance the mansion hadn't seen in years. The sun poured golden light over the sprawling gardens. The air was alive with birdsong, and the servants moved busily, decorating the place for the grand celebration. Balloons bobbed in the wind. A long table gleamed with cakes and pastries, and laughter echoed as children from the neighborhood were invited to join the festivities. For most of his life, Daniel's birthdays had been quiet affairs, gifts delivered in shiny boxes, parties attended out of obligation rather than joy. But this year was different. Something in the boy's spirit had shifted. He no longer wanted to watch life pass by. He wanted to live it. Still, fear gnawed at him. His progress had been remarkable. He could now stand on his own for several minutes, take shaky steps with support, and even walk small distances with Grace's guiding hand. But walking, truly walking, in front of so many people, that felt like a mountain too high to climb. Grace, however, believed otherwise. On the morning of his birthday, she knelt by his chair and said, "Today is your day, Daniel, not to hide, not to watch, but to show the world what you're made of." Daniel swallowed hard. "What if I fall?" "Then you'll rise," Grace replied firmly. "Falling isn't failure. Staying down is. And you, Daniel, are not someone who stays down." Her words lodged deep in his chest, giving him courage he didn't know he had. The celebration began with music and laughter. Children darted across the garden, chasing balls and balloons, their energy filling the air with life. Parents mingled, servants served drinks, and Mr. Harrison, ever the proud host, watched from the terrace, though his eyes never strayed far from his son. Daniel sat quietly in his wheelchair at first, watching as he always had. The children raced across the grass, their feet pounding the earth with freedom he had only dreamed of. His heart pounded in rhythm with them, a mix of envy and longing. Grace leaned close, her voice soft but steady. "Do you remember the first time you stood? How your legs trembled, how your heart raced. You thought it was impossible, but you did it. Today, you'll do more." Daniel's hands gripped the armrests tightly. His breath came quick, his palms slick with sweat. He wanted to believe her, but fear whispered its cruel doubts. What if I embarrass myself? What if they laugh? What if I'm not ready? As if sensing his thoughts, Grace placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Daniel. It's moving forward despite it. And I'll be right here." The moment came when the children began a football game in the center of the garden. Shouts of joy filled the air as the ball rolled near Daniel's chair. A boy picked it up and, without thinking, handed it to him. "Want a kick?" the boy asked innocently. A hush fell over the group. Everyone knew Daniel couldn't. The children froze, their eyes flicking between the ball, Daniel, and his wheelchair. Even the servants paused, their laughter dying into silence. Daniel's heart thumped wildly. For a moment, he almost shook his head and handed the ball back. But then he saw Grace's face, calm, steady, filled with unwavering belief. And something inside him snapped. "I want to try," Daniel said, his voice louder than he expected. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mr. Harrison stood up abruptly, his eyes wide. "Daniel." But before he could say more, Grace was already helping the boy to his feet. Her hands gripped his firmly, her eyes locked on his. "One step at a time," she whispered. Daniel's legs trembled violently. The grass felt uneven beneath him, and his knees threatened to buckle. But he clung to Grace, his chest burning with determination. One shaky step, then another. The crowd held its breath. Servants froze, children stared in disbelief, and Mr. Harrison's eyes filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. Daniel's legs wobbled, but he didn't fall. His body swayed, but Grace steadied him. Step after step, he moved closer to the ball. Each step was a battle. Each breath was a war. But with every movement, Daniel felt something powerful rise within him. "I can. I will." Finally, he reached the ball. His chest heaved, his body screamed with effort, but he lifted his leg just slightly and tapped the ball forward. It rolled across the grass, small and simple, but to Daniel, it was the greatest victory of his life. The garden erupted. Cheers rang out, claps thundered, and tears streamed down faces both young and old. The children cheered his name. Servants wept openly, and Mr. Harrison collapsed to his knees, covering his face with trembling hands. Daniel, shaking but standing tall, turned to his father. His eyes shone with tears, but his smile was brighter than the sun. "You did it," Mr. Harrison whispered hoarsely, rushing to embrace him. "My boy, you did it." But Daniel shook his head gently. He turned toward Grace, his voice soft but strong. "No, Father, we did it." Grace's eyes glistened, her lips curving into the proudest smile she had ever worn. She didn't need recognition, didn't need thanks. The sight of Daniel standing, fighting, and believing was enough. From that day forward, Daniel was no longer the boy trapped in his wheelchair. He was a boy who stood, who fought, who dared to do the impossible. The boy who proved that strength doesn't come from muscles or medicine alone. It comes from belief, from courage, from refusing to give up. And though the road ahead was still long, Daniel knew one truth with absolute certainty. He was no longer defined by what he couldn't do. He was defined by the miracle he created. Step by step, with a maid who believed in him when no one else did.